Hey everybody, today I want to right some wrongs because in some of my recent videos I had omitted details that I had intended to include in the video, but once I started recording, completely forgot about them. Fortunately, you guys caught them in the comments. Now some of them were no big deal, but some of them I was kind of embarrassed that I had missed. But I'll start with the no big deal ones. And one was from one of my Q&A videos, and in it, Goshen Niverdowski, not sure if I said that right, asked what kind of arborvitae are behind you. And so I brought those two types of arborvitae in here because they are a little bit more unusual, mainly because of that beautiful golden color that they both get, but they're very different varieties. So this one here is an Eastern arborvitae. It's called FILIPS Magic Moment. It's put out by Proven Winners, and these both stay a decent size, like they're a nice size. They don't get super large. They might over 20 years get quite a bit larger than what the tag says, but for the most part they're good landscape varieties for the yard. They do a nice job, and you can see how nice and tight the habit is on this one, and it stays in that pyramidal shape. Now this one over here is a Western arborvitae, so that's more native to kind of the Rockies and west of there, and you can see has a much more feathery type of leaf on it, and so it definitely has a little bit more open airiness, but still has that beautiful golden color. Big difference between the two is that the Western arborvitae usually isn't a favorite of the deer. They will still come and munch on it. They still might hack it down, but not in the same way that they do the Eastern arborvitae. They don't really like this one quite as much. So sometimes a little bit better option if you have just a mild deer problem. If you have a severe deer problem, arborvitae probably aren't an answer no matter which kind you get. But both of these, great landscape varieties, really love them. Now there are some non-proven winner varieties, so like the JANTAR cedar is very similar to the FILIPS Magic Moment, and then for fluffy, I think it's called, I wrote it down, let me see, Forever Goldie. So we've carried both of those, and they do get those beautiful colors on them, so want to make sure I let you know about that. And then people had there was one tree that people were really curious about. So Kristen Stevens wrote, "What a beautiful tree over your shoulder while you were trimming the hostas. It is absolutely stunning." Lois Laney writes, "Wow, the color of those trees in the background when you were cutting the hostas, beautiful." And that is a gorgeous tree, but I will say that normally it's not one that gets really great fall color. It is, I think, what is it, a Princeton gold maple? I think that's it. If I'm wrong, I'll put the correction down at the bottom. And that one, usually its big show is in the springtime, because when the new leaves emerge, they are this beautiful golden kind of green chartreuse color, and it looks like it's glowing in the springtime. This year, the conditions seem to be just right for it to get that beautiful golden color in the fall. Normally, they don't have quite that intensity. Usually they just turn kind of yellow and then they just fall off. So it's not one of the showiest maples out there. But this year, I don't know what was going on. The conditions were perfect and it was absolutely stunning. So I do love that tree. It is one of my favorite trees as well, but mainly because it has that beautiful spring color. It holds that golden color throughout the summer, but it's really in the spring when it's really showy, and then some years you're going to get that great show in the fall. So there we go. Now you know what was behind me in those videos, and actually when I was watching those videos back, I thought I better put that in, just put a little note in there, and I completely forgot. So I'm glad you guys asked about that because I love talking about those. On the topic of hydrangea trimming, Amanda King writes, "I just cut mine back. Being in Michigan, if you leave the blooms on, they tend to get heavy with wet snow." And I do trim mine back in October, and I forget, usually when I'm talking about trimming hydrangeas, I do mention the snow load. Some places are going to be more prone to that, and it can crack your branches, especially if they're close to your house and you get snow collecting or coming down off your roof. It can be really a problem, so I didn't mention that. Also, TJ Michigai writes, "I was under the impression we had to cover our big leaf hydrangea in the winter. It's not much larger than your Skyview macrophylla. I've been wrapping it up in burlap for the last few years, but is it really necessary? I'm in zone 6A here in mid-Michigan. Any advice would be appreciated." And hey, I kind of have a policy of not doing any kind of wrapping or protecting of my macrophylla hydrangeas. I definitely don't do it on paniculata or the arborescent varieties. With macrophyllas, I kind of feel like, hey, they're already at risk. I'm not going to go through the trouble of wrapping them. Now, I have heard of people, especially if they have one that's a little bit on the verge of their zone, wrapping it like in chicken wire and then filling it full of like leaves and stuff just to help insulate it and protect those buds. But I don't know, for me, it's just not something I want to do every year. By wrapping it in burlap, you probably were protecting it a little. It's just important that you get that burlap off at a good point in the springtime, because you don't want the new leaves starting to emerge and still having that burlap on there. I think that can kind of cause some problems if you're not careful, but you don't want to take it off too late because that's when those buds and those leaves end up getting damaged, is those late frosts that we get here in Michigan. So you probably weren't doing anything wrong, but I just feel like it's not worth it. And there's so many new varieties that are a little bit hardier. So I would look for some of the zone 5 and zone 4 varieties, especially if you're in zone 6. There's really, not necessarily a reason, unless you're an area that's really prone to late freezes. Then you might want to think about something, but then you could probably just cover them when those freezes come. I don't know, might be too much work. I like to get plants that are really suited for my area. I think that's the easiest way to do it. That way I don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Bonnie McCormick writes, we've had a few small frosts and my roses are doing great, tolerating it, but my big leaf hydrangeas melted. Do I do anything for them? She said she has a pink lace cap and a pink mop head. Now, macrophylla varieties are a little bit different when it comes to their wintering and their leaves, because they have those big, lush, plush leaves on them, and they tend to hold on to their leaves longer than like the panicle varieties and the arborescent varieties. Don't worry. I mean, some years I've had my macrophyllas where they look like they're just holding on to their leaves almost the whole winter, and before they start really looking bad. In other years, it's like they just wilt right there, and like she said, they kind of look like they melted. I just leave them. I don't worry about it. They're going to be fine. And I think sometimes that has to do with moisture. Like, is there a lot of drought? Did they get hit really hard with a sudden frost? I think there's a lot of factors that could have caused that, but don't panic at all. They're going to be just fine. And basically what I usually do is I end up cleaning those leaves out in the spring, because like I said, they tend to hold on to their leaves for such a long time, and that's not a variety that we prune. So, that's what we do with those macrophyllas. So don't panic about your macrophylla. If the leaves look funny or whatever right now, don't worry about it. If you did have anything like powdery mildew or insects or something that were really giving you problems on that macrophylla, you are going to want to make sure and get those leaves out of there in the springtime at least, or if there's anything that fell now, just get that out there now, because you just want to get rid of that problem or try to alleviate that issue. Might still be there next year, but at least you might be mitigating it just a little bit. And then in that video where I showed you how I was planting bulbs in containers, I completely missed a lot of stuff. I think I was a little kind of off kilter because I didn't have my microphone. I'm trying to solve the problem today with just this little mic here. My microphone's back at my house in the Upper Peninsula, and so I'm just making do with what I can. But I was a little disjointed in that video. I can tell when I watched it, I was like, oh, I was kind of stumbling a little bit. But I still think I got the major points across, but there's a couple things that I completely missed and had been thinking about them all before I did the video. So D-Light writes, will Miracle Grow potting mix be okay, or do I need something heavier like a raised bed soil? She's in zone 6B. She'll leave the containers outdoors on her apartment's uncovered patio. Really, when it comes to the soil and bulbs, don't panic about it too much. You just don't want a soil that's going to stay really wet and muddy. So like a lot of times you could even just leave the soil in your containers, plant the bulbs in there, and usually they're going to do fine because those bulbs have pretty much everything they need to flower that year. Now, if you want them to keep going, so like tulips are like, oh, for me, I always consider them a little bit of a once and done unless you get specific varieties that are meant to come back. So those, it's like, don't worry about it. I just use bad soil with that. Doesn't matter. So you can have used soil with that, or you could have that used soil, just add a little fertilizer on top or compost or something like that. Otherwise, Miracle Grow is going to work. Your regular potting soil, garden soil, they don't really seem to mind too much, and as long as they don't, end up getting really wet. And some of you guys had left comments that you said, hey, mine rotted. And most common problem is the soil was too wet. And I think there's some questions here, so I'm going to touch on those. Jean Tarwater wrote, how do you water them through the winter? I tried this last fall, putting the bulbs in large containers outside, and all of them rotted. Meanwhile, the ones in ground were fine. Leah wrote, do you water them before storing them? Okay, so once I plant them, I do make sure I give them water, and I give them a good dose of water, and then where I'm at, I just kind of leave them alone. I will check on them. Usually, like right now, I probably wouldn't check on them till like Christmas time, and then maybe I'll check on them again in August. I mean, not August, whoa, that would be a long time. January, but for the most part, like last year, the ones that I had in our cold frame, I didn't have to add any water all winter long. In fact, when I brought them out, they were still quite wet. So I'm pretty lucky. If you're in a really dry area, you're going to want to keep a track of that. So one thing to look at is if the soil is pulling away from the pot a little bit, then that means it is probably drying out. So just stick your finger in there. If it feels dry, go ahead or lift it up. If it feels really light, that's another way to tell. If it does completely dry down, you're going to want to carefully and gradually add water back into it, because otherwise it probably flows right through. And I did mention in the video that if your drainage holes get plugged or frozen, sometimes that can hold excess water as well. And so that can be a problem. So the big thing is if you're leaving them outside, you want to make sure that they don't get like soupy wet at any point. If they're frozen, don't worry about it. Like if the soil completely freezes with water, not going to be a big deal. But if they are sitting in that water, that's just a recipe for them to just start to rot, especially when it starts getting warmer. If they can't get any oxygen, they just fail. It's just not a good scene. Then we also have Lisa Gell wrote, regarding timing tulips, daffodils, and to bloom together, the Color Blends website has a page that actually does list all of their bulbs that would bloom at times relative to each other. It's still an estimation, but at least it's a start if you want to try to overlap blooms like a late daffodil with an early tulip. So I really appreciate knowing that because I haven't really spent much time on the Color Blends website. I really should because they have some really interesting varieties, and I think they have a lot of good features on their website as well. But I always forget about them. But that's a really nice thing. So if you are looking like you want continuous bloom all spring, or if you want to have a container where everything blooms at once, or things are kind of blooming at different times, that's a really great resource. So thank you for sharing that with us. Also in that video, I had referenced Liam's style of selecting plants using the scientific method of because I like it. And you guys seem to like that comment. So Cindy Bunker wrote, because I like it, the scientific method. I love that. And then Catherine Logan wrote, I had some of my most beautiful combinations using the Liam method. Being surprised is more fun. And, that is kind of how Liam likes to pick things or how to do things. He's just like, I like it. Will it work? Or can I make it work? And so that's actually kind of a fun way to approach things. So you're like, I know I really want that. How can I make it happen? And that way, that's just your goal, is to get that one thing that you like. And if it fails too, that's one thing I like, is that if it doesn't make it, it's kind of like, well, it didn't work. I have to either try something else or try something totally different next time. So I don't know, I have a little bit more of that experimental kind of vein in me, and that's in my personality. So it works. And when it came to digging up my cannas and storing them for the winter, a lot of you had a lot more experience than I did. It was reassuring because a lot of you said like, hey, I think you're going to be okay. A lot of you had just some advice on how you do it. So I would recommend you go back to that video and look at the comments because people have really contributed a lot. I'll go through with just some of the highlighted ones here. So Angie wrote, I'm laughing at this video because you sound like I did when I dug mine up last week. Will they sprout? Did I cut the stem too short? Is my basement going to be too warm? Is my garage too cold? Are they going to shrivel being in wood shavings? Oh, the questions. Good luck. If you have anything, this would be a learning experience for both of us. And it is true. That's kind of how I am when I'm trying this new stuff, where I keep thinking like, I see people do this with complete confidence, and then I get in there and I'm like, there's all these other factors that I could really mess up. But then I just let go of that, keep doing it the way I'm doing it, and see what lessons I learn from there. Other comments like Marilyn Richard wrote, I wrap my canna in newspaper and put them in a dark place. Very simple solution. Samuel Jarmilo wrote, I've grown cannas for 20 years now. I grow all my canna in very large pots. I cut the stems off first, then I pull them out of the potting soil, then I let them dry for 1 week. Cut the roots off, then I put them in a box and cover them with peat moss to keep them dry. Make sure to label every variety and keep them in a cool, dry space. Also cut the seed pods, and that will keep your plant blooming beautifully. So as the seed pods appear, cut them off and it'll encourage more blooms. That's in the blooming season. Come spring, bring them out and replant them, and they will grow beautifully. At least that's what I think when Samuel mentioned the seed pods. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it was. If not, well, just cut those seed pods off. That's all I'm going to say. Peg wrote, there's a great video from Horn Canna Farm about overwintering canna. I followed it and kept mine in buckets in the basement. I cheat and start mine under grow lights in the basement. So that's a video I didn't get to see yet, but I'm going to check that out. And she let us in. Like, you can start them a little early. So if you're starting seeds or something like that and you have some grow lights, go ahead and start your canna early. They're going to benefit from that early boost. And that way, once it warms up, they're going to be able to really grow really fast. Because canna grow quite quickly once they get up to a certain size. Like once they actually, I noticed like once they get to the edge of the pot too, then they really start to take off. Green Thumbelina writes, I just dig my cannas and store them in my cool dark basement in large paper bags or cardboard boxes, and they are ready to plant in the spring. And then she mentions the purple oxalis, that was the shamrocks that I had. They can also be easily dug and stored similarly. You'll have oodles of small, long pink colored bulbs all attached to an opaque, carrot-like structure that needs to be left on the clusters of bulbs. This is a moisture source, keeps them from drying completely over the winter. I leave the clumps of tiny bulbs intact until I'm ready to plant them in the spring, and then I separate them and plant each tiny pinkish bulb. So I didn't think of saving mine. I should have done that, maybe try it, but maybe next year. Terry D writes, I have grown canna for 15 years in central Indiana, zone 6. Here's my method, and it's been very successful. After the first frost kills the tops, I cut them off, dig canna rhizomes, and let them dry for a day or so. I get large totes, put a layer of potting soil, a layer of leaves, layer of cannas. Stack as many as I can and water sparingly. Store in a garage that stays about 40 degrees. Don't seal the lid. I usually just put an old furnace filter over the top. Check about once a month. Water a tiny bit if very dry. That works for me. So thank you, Terry D, for sharing that. And KAC writes, I have had very good luck with common cannas, but the fancier ones, not so much. My common ones always get huge and I end up discarding some because they multiply so well. My fancy ones will winter over, but never seem to make more tubers and are less vigorous. Maybe that's just me. So it'd be interesting to see. I only have the one fancy kind, and I don't even know if it's considered fancy or not. So we'll see how that does for me. So thanks for letting us know, because that's reassuring to know that sometimes certain varieties maybe are less prolific than others. This last comment is a little bit more of a conversation starter because it really got the wheels in my head turning a little when Jean and Kelly had mentioned about there not being many shows on television about gardening or garden shows. And when I thought about it, I'm like, you're right. And especially I mentioned like HGTV, like they've completely abandoned the garden part of HGTV. And I loved their comment because it was, HGTV is too busy redoing everyone's home in California modern or farmhouse industrial, so nothing to see there. PBS shows a garden smart show. Much of it takes place in the South. And so when I thought about it, I'm like, well, why is that? And I think part of it is any kind of gardening content, number one, weather dependent. So climate can play a big role in, when they can film and what you can do, because if you're having really bad weather, you're really limited in what you can do. Also, I think there's always that concern because there's so many different growing zones, there might be some issue with like, how are you going to keep everybody interested? But then I look at the comments that come in on like my channel and all the other YouTube channels, and it seems like most people who are watching, at least on YouTube, they're okay with watching things from other zones. They're always actually very interested, and some of the comments are really supportive, especially when I'm talking about things like lilacs or hydrangeas, and people are like, oh, I wish I could grow that. Other people will say like, oh, I don't even know how you do it with the cold weather. Like, I can't even imagine. So I don't know if that's so much of a problem. However, television is a completely different beast. And then I always think like, well, I guess home makeover shows are really quite simple in the sense that in a very specific time frame, they can remodel a room or remodel an entire house. Whereas when we're doing garden stuff, it's, really in over time. So yes, we can transform a space in a matter of a day. However, the real effects or the long-term effects really happen, in year 2 and 3 and 4. And I don't think modern television production has that patience. However, I feel like those of us on YouTube, we're just kind of showing you guys as we go. So you're getting to see projects, that we did 2 years ago, and we revisit those. And so it does become more of a relationship. And I don't know, maybe modern production isn't into that for television. I'm not really sure. And then I always think, wouldn't it be kind of fun to watch like a garden challenge type of show where, they're trying to solve problems or they're addressing issues, or it's a competition type of thing. And the only drawback with that is television does like to have like everything wrapped up in a bow at the end. And so I think in those kind of situations, there's going to be this tendency for them to choose maybe not the best plants for each situation, because they're either going to pick only the really big mature plants or only things that are flowering, even though it might not be the best option for that location, or they're going to plant things too tight because they want it to look nice and full and finished. And then in 2 or 3 years, it's going to be so overgrown, it's going to be a pain. So I think some of those competition shows might be a little challenging. That said, I guess that's why so many of us are hooked on garden content on YouTube, because that's really a good place to go. I think you also get maybe a little bit more sincerity in the sense that we're just normal people versus I think if there is going to be a show like that, it's probably going to be sponsored by some corporation or flower company or plant company or something like that, or tool company, something, you know, there's always going to be that influence coming in, and you don't see that quite as much, I think, with a lot of the independent content creators on YouTube. You also don't get that high production value, but hey, you guys don't mind that, right? You don't mind my little amateur hour here, do you? I'm curious, what kind of garden programming do you think you guys would want to watch if it was on television? Like, would you watch it on television, or do you want to stick to YouTube? I guess let's just kind of brainstorm some ideas here. So go ahead and leave some comments on maybe what you're thinking or things that you think might be a lot of fun to pay attention to. It might influence me or some other YouTubers to maybe try to create some of that content. I don't think I'm going to have any influence on the television production companies or anything like that. But that said, I will say Magnolia did do that documentary on Floret, which was kind of interesting. I only watched part of the first season, and then it was in the wintertime, and then we started planting, and I never finished it, so I got to get on that. So anyway, love to hear your comments. Thank you guys for watching. Do appreciate it. I'll see you guys all in the next video.